board. And I think I said that entrepreneurs tend to be overconfident of their ability, and the great economist Frank Knight of the University of Chicago argued that the chief beneficiary of entrepreneurial overconfidence is the general public, because that innovation comes from this overconfidence, and for everyone that succeeds, there's many that fail. And those who fail are kind of allowing themselves to make sacrifices on behalf of the one that succeeds. So in the end, the public benefits because a lot of people try. Anchoring bias, and I think I talked about some of these. Anchoring bias focuses on initial information. So, the big one is job search. And there was recently a law passed in New York that they're not supposed to ask you about your past salary. So basically, it's wrong that because you invested something or because you were paid something in the past that you should be paid that in the future. Like, if you think of an actor who starts out in a small role and then is recognized and gets a starring role in the next movie, that whatever they were paid in the small role shouldn't drive what they're paid as a star, because what economics teaches us, and you could kind of in a way say that this is a natural law, of ethics, that whatever you give, you should get in return. And so the basic principle in economics is that wage should equal the marginal revenue product. And in other words, if you produce a certain amount, you should get paid commensurate with that amount. And I think that when firms ignore that principle, what happens is people quit a lot and you have instability. So now, as a society, we've fallen into the trap of doing that. And I think the current system, which has systematically underpaid workers, is unstable. Not because there's any one wage rate that's fair. Like, I'm not saying that workers should be entitled to all of the value they create or anything like that. What I'm saying is that if somebody becomes more productive, they should be paid commensurate with that increasing productivity. And if society doesn't do that, then the workers will eventually quit or withdraw their labor or become less productive. And so there'll be instability. So basically, there's a whole host of these perceptual biases. A big one is ignoring some costs. Like, if you invest in something and it turns out to be wrong, the correct thing is to cut your losses and move on. But what a lot of people do, and we saw this, a big example of this was the Vietnam War, was that once you make a commitment, people are often tempted to persist until they completely go crazy. So in other words, they continue along the same path, even when there's evidence that a different approach is better. Now, I'm not saying, if you buy a stock and the stock falls 10%, that necessarily you should pull out. However, you can make a rule like that. And, there are people who do that. And, they say, I'll buy a stock, but if it falls 10%, I'll sell because I don't want to suffer bigger losses. But I mean, I've bought stocks that have fallen a great deal and then come back, so, and this is quite common, and Buffett tells stories like that. One I heard him talk about was Coca-Cola, which went public in 1919, and then the following year fell by 50%. because of I guess it was a shortage of sugar that pushed the sugar price up and made the Coca-Cola stock less valuable, because I guess they use sugar in their drink. And so what his point was that if you had bought Coca-Cola stock in 1919, when it first became public over 100 years ago, and you paid, I forget the price, but let's say it was like $100. It may have been more than that, for a share. It would have fallen to 50 the following year. But let's say you were born in 1919 and a grandparent bought you a share of Coca-Cola as a gift. If you held that share for the rest of your life, let's say you died at age 90 in 2009, if you had held on to that share, it would have been worth in excess of $2 million if you had invested the dividend. Buffett told that story in the mid-90s. I don't know what happened to the stock after that. It might have been modified. But basically his point in the mid-90s was that a single share of Coca-Cola went from $100 to $2 million in the period from 1919 to say 94. So it would have been, say, 75 years. And whether you had paid the 50 or paid the 100, you still would have had $2 million. So, it's true, if you paid the 50, your return would have been twice as high. But let's face it, 100, if you invest 100 and get back 2 million, that's like a great return, regardless of that the price had fallen. So basically, often it pays to just not pay attention to the stock market, and that's what Buffett teaches us. But at the same time, if there's real information that something's wrong, like let's say, and Buffett's made plenty of mistakes. I mean, Coca-Cola was a brilliant choice of his, but let's say you buy a company and the stock is falling, and you say to yourself, is this the right thing? And what you might do is search for news to see what is causing it. If it's like the panic of a market, people's insane opinions that, oh, the sky is falling down, or interest rates are going up, and that's all true. You might say, well, look, interest rates are going up, but then they'll come down again, so I'm not going to bother to trade it. A lot depends on your time horizon and so on. But the point is that a lot of us tend to, if we make a mistake, we continue to persist even when it turns out to be wrong. And a lot of the time, if there's legitimate reason to sell the stock, for instance, that the public stopped wanting the product they sell or something like that, then it's time to sell. You made a mistake. So you have to be able to assess your decisions rationally, and not believe in sunk costs. Just because you invested in something in the past doesn't mean you were right and you should invest more. I've done that at times. It's always been a mistake. All right, so there are a lot of these perceptual biases that drive our thinking and often distort what we perceive. Another one is randomness, risk aversion, hindsight bias, I mentioned last time, outcome bias, social media. Social media is a separate subject, but basically, I think social media and the media is actually, your book doesn't mention these as a source of perceptual bias, but psychological suggestion is very, very powerful. And the idea of hypnosis is not well understood. People know it works, but people don't know exactly how it works. But there's no question that suggestions given to your unconscious mind will often affect your behavior. And one of the real things in our society is the media and social media, which if you absorb material from these sources will push your mindset in a certain way and cause you to perceive things in a certain way. And basically, that will probably result in distorted decision making. I'm not saying you shouldn't look at the news, but I think you need to take the news with a grain of salt, not believe the opinions of the news media. They're part of the financial establishment, basically, and they're always going to try to put a positive spin. For example, on buying stocks, they're always going to try to make it seem like you should, do what the Wall Street establishment benefits from. And so, there are times when it can really be suicidal. They were pushing Enron until right before the company collapsed. And,
Hey, Professor, someone trying to get into class.
yeah. Okay. Let me admit them, and I'll take attendance now, and people who join later can wait. Our job isn't to make sure that people who come 20 minutes late are.
She was in class before, but then she had to log out because she couldn't hear nothing.
Fair enough. So let me take attendance. I haven't done that yet. Okay. Okay, so make a new column. And today is March 8th already. And I'm going to grade your Rashomon discussion boards probably on Friday, maybe Thursday or Friday. So be patient with that. I have a couple of things to do this week.
Professor,
Yes.
I'm about to reboot my router, so I just wanted to tell you I'm here because I might be away for like 3 minutes. So just in case I missed the attendance.
Who is that?
Gerard Walls.
Jaron. Okay, Jaron. Okay. Let's go Syed Abbas. Syed?
Here, Professor.
Hello, sir. Syed Ahmad.
Here, Professor.
Hello, sir. Samima Akhtar.
Here, Professor.
Hello, Samima. Alessandro Alessi.
Good morning, Professor.
Morning. David Pesh.
Yes, here, Professor.
Hello. Anam Bahati.
Here, Professor.
Hello, Anam. Melissa Calixto. Melissa. Winston Chan.
Oh, I'm here, Professor.
Hello, Winston.
Hello.
Ben.
Here.
Hello. Kai.
Here.
How are we doing? Ji Rui Deng.
Good morning.
Morning, sir. Farhan Aram.
Good morning, Professor.
Morning, Farhan. Brianna Faustin.
Here.
Hello, Brianna. Steve Fenn.
Here.
Hello. Jonathan Gonzalez.
Here.
Good morning. June Grant.
Here.
Hello. Minhao Hu.
Here.
Hello. Angelica. Oh, she's ill. She wrote me a letter. Jian Lin. Jian. Leon Liu.
Here, Professor. Good morning.
Morning. Elizabeth Maddox,
Here. Good morning.
Elizabeth, Rochelle Mendez,
Here.
Demi Mullings,
Here.
hello, Cameron Nahar, Nicholas Neglia,
Here.
hello, Aquino Olivier,
Here.
hello, Jenny Perfecto,
Here.
hello, Jenny, Chenille Powell,
Here, Professor.
hello, Anna Siddiqui, Anna,
Good morning, Professor.
hello, Winjin Turbov, Jaron Walls, Yi Wen Wu, Kristen Yip,
I'm here, Professor. Good morning.
good morning, Anita Zhao,
Here.
hello, and Jinran May. I think Jinran dropped, I'm not sure. Okay, so let me call the people that didn't answer the first time. All right, someone's here. Melissa Calixto. Minhao, no, I have Minhao. Angelica, Jean Lynn,
Here.
hello. Cameron Nahar. Winjin Turbov and Yuan Wu. Okay. All right, so I'm not gonna, don't, if someone comes late, they can wait until, we have a good opportunity to let them in. We don't have to drop everything just to let people in because they came 30 minutes late or something. It's distracting. So basically, moving on, I started talking last time about Graham Allison and the three interpretations of decision making that he offers in his book Essence of Decision. And he talks about the rational actor model, the bounded rationality model, and the political model. And these are very big ideas and I think very useful ones. And I think I mentioned that in my own career, both in corporate America and in big business, Johnson & Johnson, and I worked for the New York State Assembly also. I witnessed frequently that decisions were made suboptimally in order to appease the political interests of the people in powerful positions. At J&J, for instance, the hiring of a record keeper for a 401k plan that they had set up. In those days, that there was like the very beginnings of 401k plans that hadn't existed before. And J&J, of course, at that time, I don't know how many employees they had now. At that time, they had 70,000 employees, and it was a big project. And they appointed a prestigious firm, Coopers and Lybrand, which now is part of PricewaterhouseCoopers, but they had no experience in running these types of plans, and I knew it would be a mess. I told them, they ignored me, of course, and the reason was political. That the Coopers and Lybrand was the firm's auditor, and the controller was friendly with the management, and so on and so forth. And in New York State, you see this everywhere. Decisions are almost never made rationally. Even the smallest decision has political ramifications, and this is why I tell you that socialism does not lead to positive economic outcomes, because when you institute a political system to control economic phenomena, the political element of decision-making becomes more important. And the more important it becomes, the more inefficient everything becomes. And so everything is driven by politics. And the result is that people become poorer. Allison, he doesn't say that, I'm saying it. So basically, as far as the rational actor model, it's the model that leads to the most efficiency. It's how accountants and economists assume people will behave. And in the long run, if a system allows rational behavior, it allows actors to maximize profit and at the same time do that by offering products to the public that the public wants, then, and this is how a market functions, then society will benefit tremendously. The problem is that few of us are rational thinking machines, and when we have the resources and the power to behave politically, most of us will. There are exceptions, but most of us will. The bounded rationality model is an important modification of the rational actor model, and it's a realistic assessment, except for this. In the long run, firms that act irrationally, whether because it's a political choice or because they're unable to come up with a rational solution to their problem, either way, if they behave irrationally in the long run, they're going to fail. And this is the beauty of a marketplace, that rationality is rewarded and irrationality is punished. Often it seems unpleasant or tragic or undesirable that firms that make bad choices should go out of business. But without that kind of discipline, the economy becomes much less efficient. So what the bounded rationality model says, and I'll give you a minute of background about it. The two guys that created the idea of bounded rationality were Herbert Simon and James March. Wrote a book called Organizations, and it had a huge impact on organizational theory and pretty much everything in management. It's probably the most important book ever written on organizational theory and management, if not the most important. It's certainly in the top 10. And basically, they created a whole new areas, not just in thinking about business strategy and organization theory and organizational behavior, but also in economics. And that's why Herbert Simon won the Nobel Prize in economics, even though he wasn't an economist. He was really a sociologist. But the book had a huge effect in thinking about the role of information in business decision making. So basically, the idea of bounded rationality is that we cannot know what we do not know, and as a result, business decisions are rarely, if ever, made with full rationality. So the model is a criticism of neoclassical economic theory, which assumes that people making decisions are going to make an optimal choice. And basically what March and Simon argued is that businesses, because they don't know the payoffs from an investment, like if you buy a stock, you might analyze it, you might think carefully and value the company, but you don't really know in the end what's going to happen. There could be things that happen that are unexpected, or there was a variable that you missed, or, it could be any host of things. And basically, we can't know in the end what all the considerations are, and we can't know in the end what the payoffs are. from the investment. So basically, choosing among investments and choosing among business strategies is ultimately involves a degree of intuition and perception. And so for that reason, in building, let's call it right-brained, intuitive kinds of thinking is important, because the methodical, the left brain, the mathematical way of thinking only goes so far. And often you have to temper rationality with practical considerations. So basically, there's a great book which I recommend. It has an out-of-date title. It's entitled "Winning Office Politics: A Guide for the '90s" by Andrew Dubrin. But these things don't change. And basically, one of the points he makes, he says that there are three criteria. There are three criteria, and I'll put it on the whiteboard, for making a decision. The first one, he says, is NPV, net present value. And those of you who are accountants know that the net present value is the present value of the future earnings flow discounted to the present. And you subtract from that the amount you're investing, and that gives you whether there's a positive return and how big it is. The return on investment is the annual profit made from the investment, ROI, and how much money is made, say on average, from the investment. So, if you invest in the stock market, you invest $1 and the market goes up 9% and you get 2% dividends, then you get an 11% return on investment. And that occurs every year. And so you make a good return. And the third one he called PPP, which is less famous, and that stands for President's Pet Project. Okay, and basically what that's saying is that there's always going to be political considerations, and they will often blow out of the water the rational ones. Okay, the NPV and the ROI. And so that doesn't make the other two wrong in a long-term meaning, or in a analytical meaning. Those were still the right decisions. But from the standpoint of your political position in the company and where you need to put your reputation, it's to make the president happy. All right, so that's why in any decision situation, the rationality is often trumped, as Graham Allison puts it, by political thinking. But it's also true, and just to repeat myself, that the ROI and NPV are never perfectly understood either. So basically, anyone making a decision needs to do the best they can, do their due diligence, and try to be as smart as possible. But if you read organizations, and I do recommend it as a book to read in the summer or something, by March and Simon, it's a very, very rigorous book. And if you read it, you start to realize that the assumption that we all make that we're smart is wrong, that we're not that smart, and we're going to always make a lot of mistakes, and so everything is muddling through, kind of, and and they give a million reasons why this is true. So in the end, what they're saying is that much of management is an informational problem. And we need to manage well, we need to manage information. Very, very important insight. And so basically it ties in with strategy, it ties in with how you design organizations. Organizations need to be designed so that the units are best equipped to acquire information. And so that means highly centralized organizations tend to be less adept at acquiring information. It's much easier to get information if you're close to the ground. And so decentralized systems tend to be far more efficient because they make more efficient use of information. This incidentally was an insight of Friedrich von Hayek, who wrote an incredible article in the American Economic Review in the late 1940s called The Use of Knowledge in Society. And I'll put it on the screen share for a second. And what he says in there is that a market system is by definition going to be more efficient than a centralized planning system. So basically it's available for free here. Basically what he says is that, first of all, the knowledge specific to time and place is of incredible value. And it's very rarely understood by academics, that because academics tend to think in terms of theory and abstractly. And so if you really look at why decisions are made well, it's usually because somebody has access to direct information, and that occurs best when you're in the time and place where events are happening. So things that happen, problems that are solved on the ground are going to be solved much better than if they're solved by someone in an ivory tower who doesn't understand what the variables are. And number two, that how you communicate information throughout a system is critical. And in a centralized system, there's far too much rigidity. Centralized systems are very rigid. And so, if you have a company, American businesses recognize this and has gradually, in the 1950s, they had these hierarchies that they've since decentralized, downsized, I mean. And what Hayek is saying is that in order to get information, you need a flexible method of communicating information. And the only economic variable that is capable of doing this is price, which is a barometer of the interaction of supply and demand. So basically, through real time, supply and demand shifts, that's immediately transmitted into price. And so local decision-making is facilitated by the price system. However, in a highly centralized system, you don't have price. So as a result, if you look at the socialist economies, they tend to have 5-year plans. Hitler, incidentally, had a 4-year plan. Stalin, a 5-year plan. Mao, they had 5-year plans. So basically, these kind of long-term plans, while they're great to express goals and to give people a sense of community and the focus, from an economic standpoint, are inefficient because they lack the flexibility. So basically, what I'm talking about then is ways to handle information. And so your perception of what reality is will be tested in a market economy, and it could be wrong or it could be right. The market will give its opinion as to what that is. Whereas in a non-market economy, there is no test. There's no test at all. And so the autocrats who run the system can determine what everyone should buy or what demand will be in 5 years. And if people don't agree with that, too bad, they're still going to produce it. And so this kind of flexibility doesn't exist. And so perception becomes limited to the perceptions of a few elite planners. All right, so what are some of the things that determine this kind of thing, that determine decision making? Personality is a big factor. People who have the trait of openness, if you recall from when we talked about personality, there are the big 5 personality traits: neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeability, and conscientiousness. And people who have a lot of openness tend to have less self-serving bias, and so they're going to probably make somewhat better decisions. Intellectual ability does not cure self-serving bias and overconfidence, but it is associated with cognitive flexibility and selecting good decision-making strategies. So the stronger your intellectual ability, you're going to, in some ways, be better at making decisions, but in other ways, you're still going to be prone to important cognitive biases. And this is the point Jonathan Haidt makes in his book, The Righteous Mind, that when people get into political debates and disagree with each other, they don't look to find the right answer. They look rather to prove their point. And so self-serving bias largely drives most of the conversation. Okay. There are some minor gender differences in decision making. Men are more prone to risk taking, and there's also some cultural differences. Cultures differ as to time orientation towards rationality, and preference for collectivism. And these kinds of things will affect the kinds of decisions that the decision makers make. There are also, of course, a lot of organizational constraints on decision making, performance evaluations and reward systems. If a number of years ago, Steve Kerr, not the football coach, but he was a management professor at USC, and then he became the head of training for General Electric, and became very famous. He was already well known. I once met him, and he then went on, I think, and then he became the head of training at Goldman Sachs, and did that for a while. And basically, Steve wrote a famous article called "The Folly of Hoping for A and Rewarding B." And so basically the idea is that if you set up a reward system in your company and you say to people, I'm going to pay you a bonus if you do X, like if you say to salespeople, I'm going to pay you a commission if you make a sale, it's folly to then hope that the same salespeople are going to concentrate on customer service. If you want them to concentrate on customer service, you have to pay them to do that. This idea directly contradicts the claims of the human relations school and also the job redesign movement that argues that people are not motivated by money. I think that's false. I always thought that was nonsense. And Steve's piece, I think, it makes a good point. I'm not saying that people are 100% motivated by money, but I think people ultimately are. And so reward systems will affect people's perceptions, and they will affect people's decision making. formal regulations, time constraints, the cultural attributes of a company and the way things are done are going to radically affect perception and decision making. A great example of that, you probably never even heard of the A&P Corporation, which until the 1960s was the dominant supermarket chain and the largest retailer in the country. It was so large that there was an antitrust suit brought against it in the 1940s because it was too big. And yet by the 1970s, it was failing, and now it's out of business altogether. There were some remnants of it in that 8 o'clock coffee. If you see that in the store, that used to be their store brand. And it was so popular that when they were failing, they sold off the store brand to make some money because a lot of people wanted that kind of coffee. But basically, why did they fail? Because the people who inherited the company from the children of the founders, it had been founded in 1850 in Lower Manhattan, and it became a national chain. And the children, but the founders ran it for a long time, and the children ran it for a long time. So it was like almost 100 years, I think, between the two generations. And then when the children died, they didn't have children themselves, and the management that took over lacked the imagination of the first of the two generations that ran it. And when they were confronted with the competition of Kmart and Walmart, especially, which Walmart, of course, ultimately overcame Kmart. When they were confronted with this new kind of store, this discount store using all kinds of new technologies to reduce price and selling at low prices to large numbers of people, when they were confronted with this competition, they were unable to adjust to it. And so they were ultimately driven out of business because their history did not open the door to their creativity. This wasn't true of the second generation, who were faced in the 1920s with the invention of the modern supermarket. And A&P had been a small shop selling tea and coffee and groceries. And it was a small store. It was pre-supermarket. And they transformed it in the 1920s into the largest supermarket chain and became dominant in the supermarket field. An equal manager in the 1960s would have equally transformed it to compete with Walmart and would have been a different kind of competitor. But that didn't happen because they lacked the imagination. So basically, history and culture will often drive decisions. And unless there is some kind of intuitive ability to overcome your cultural constraints, to overcome the artificial constraints that drive a lot of people's thinking, firms will often die when confronted with new circumstances. All right, so what are the steps to rational decision making? Define the problem, identify the decision criteria, weight the criteria, select the best alternative and evaluate it, and then implement and follow up the decision. And I already talked about how bounded rationality limits your ability to think rationally, but that's not to say you shouldn't apply rational problem solving. It's just that it's often not enough, but that should be a first step in solving a problem. If you can't solve it using ordinary rational methods, then you need to start thinking creatively and intuitively. All right, now that said, I want to talk a little bit about ethics, which I started to at the beginning, and then we'll move into Rashomon. If we don't have time for Rashomon today, we can get to it next time. There are three, your book talks about three kinds of ethical criteria. This is sort of a canned thing. It's really not true. There's all kinds of alternative ethical systems. But your book talks about utilitarianism, which means you can also call it consequentialism, which means that people make a decision based on the consequences of their actions. For example, the classic statement of utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number. If a decision results in the greatest good for the greatest number, then it satisfies the consequentialist or utilitarian model. Another approach would be deontology or deonance, duty-based. And basically, in a duty-based model, it's not the consequences that drive it, but rather the duties themselves, that there are certain duties or responsibilities that are inherently moral. There are rules, and we should not violate those rules. So the Ten Commandments is the classic example. You can find these kinds of duty-based ethical models in every religion, I believe. And also, if you look at the third one, it's also really a duty-based. Your book adds legally derived rights. And this would also in part be a duty-based, because if the idea of legality is that you conform to a law, and the law is a duty. So our society is basically based on, what you might call deontological reasoning, that we all need to comply with the law. Now, the idea of legally derived rights suggests that there are rights that are created, that they're not inherent. And this is a big debate between let's say liberals and advocates of state activism. Liberals meaning, it's not how the word is usually used, but liberals meaning people who don't believe in state intervention, believe in freedom. That's the traditional meaning of liberal. Where it was converted to mean the opposite later, but a clean meaning of it is that people who don't believe in state intervention. And then the idea is that there's such a thing as positive rights versus negative rights. So advocates of state intervention hold that people have certain rights that can be guaranteed by the state, such as healthcare. Whereas liberals would say that people have the right to be free from government compulsion, and so can't be forced to be in healthcare or subsidized healthcare. It's kind of like the debate about COVID, that a lot of people objected to, say, mandated vaccines. The rationale for that is that it's a positive right of the public to be free from people who can convey the virus. The negative right is the state doesn't have the right to compel me to take a vaccine. So, there's always going to be debate about this, because I don't think it's solvable. It's like you either want a life free of state control, or you want a life filled with security and government programs that help you. And so, I think there are different kinds of people, and some don't mind risk and prefer freedom. Some like security and dislike risk. And so I think personality plays a big role in which point of view people prefer. So basically, if you look, I think the philosophical treatment of ethics largely mirrors how perception is viewed. So Descartes argued that God guarantees the accuracy of our perceptions. And so from that would come a moral system based on religion, which was a traditional, model, both in Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere, that there's a social morality that is true. Hume, in turn, argued that nothing is knowable because cause and effect are illusory constructs. And so what Hume argued was that ethics are primarily emotional. When I first read a treatise on human understanding, to me, that said that ethics is not real because it's not rational. It's not based on reason. And as I read a little bit more later on, I realized it's not really so bad. I mean, if you say that ethics is primarily emotional, that it's not based on reason, that doesn't mean that ethics is unimportant. It just means that it's not based on rational deduction. This idea that ethics is based on rational deduction it comes from the Middle Ages, and Descartes wanted to defend it. But basically, I think Hume kind of shows that you can't really derive what we consider right or wrong from any kind of logical deduction. And he gives a lot of examples of it in his writing, and so basically we feel things are right or wrong based on our emotional makeup. Now, basically, that doesn't mean they're unimportant. It just means that they're emotional. Kant argued that he responded to Hume. His work was in large part a response to Hume, and argued that you can say that the human mind is rational because although we can't know the world in itself, he grants that to Hume. We can't know the ultimate truth. In order for us to function as human beings, we perceive the world in a certain way, and so we all share the same perceptions. And therefore, in terms of human experience, all of our perceptions are organized by the 12 categories of reason and the 3 moral imperatives, the categorical imperatives, which organize the world. So basically, Kant tried to reconcile the claims of Hume that reason is an illusion, and I don't think he ultimately succeeds, in part because he argues, for example, that our morals are driven by 3 categorical imperatives, which are that our every action should be a universal law, that we should always treat people as ends in themselves and never as means to an end, and that we should always act as legislators in a kingdom where people are ends in themselves. And so these are all very noble ideas, but it doesn't really overcome Hume's objection, because you could say, well, what makes those moral? What logical basis shows that those categories are moral? And so Kant just opens the door to an infinite regress, which does not overcome Hume's point that there's no real logical basis for morality. And again, that doesn't mean it's bad or it's non-existent. It just means that it's not logical. This idea was carried forward later on by a philosopher in the early 20th century named G.E. Moore, who coined the term the naturalistic fallacy, the idea that ethical considerations don't exist in nature, that they're not objective facts, and such deductions are not rationally supported. So basically, if you you look at this history, it's not surprising that your book concludes that morality is ultimately emotional, and this is found in studies that they talk about. So basically, there is no moral imperative that makes one person's morality superior to another's. And I think that is what has gotten a lot of companies into trouble recently with the ESG movement. The ESG movement, environmental sustainability and governance, argues that there are certain political points of view that are objectively correct. And the companies started arguing that, well, what happened was the people who don't agree with those positions reacted, and some of them are attacking the companies that have advocated it. So years ago, Milton Friedman, a great economist who died maybe 10, 15 years ago, I was teaching at Brooklyn College already when he died. 2006, so it would have been 17 years ago. Friedman wrote a article in the New York Times magazine I think it was in 1970, and the title of it was "The Social Responsibility of Businesses to Make a Profit." And his point wasn't that business shouldn't care about adhering to ethical standards. This is just a natural thing that you obey the law and you avoid hurting people and stuff like that. I don't think that was his point. His point was that business should not be engaged in social causes that go beyond the purpose of their existence, which is to produce something, whatever it is. Because I think in part, to produce something is very difficult in itself. And to make a better product or to run a better store or, whatever it is, requires huge intellectual challenges that are rarely respected by academics or politicians. Because of that, it's a distraction to worry about saving the whales or, things that the people who run the business aren't especially equipped to do and are not expert in. And so if they divert funds for purposes other than their business, they'll probably perform less well than otherwise. And the point also is that if a stockholder favors a certain charity, they can collect a dividend and then give to that charity. What would make the management of a company better equipped to evaluate which charity to give to than the stockholders would be? So Friedman's point, I think, is, the article is probably quoted 1 million times in various business ethics contexts, and it's usually attacked and disagreed with. But I think the problem with the ESG stuff is that it all has one point of view, and not everybody agrees with that point of view. And then what happens if the company starts taking political positions is that the public that likes it is going to buy from them. The public that doesn't like it isn't going to buy from them. And so it becomes a whole mishmash of animosity, and it's really unnecessary. So that's where I would go with that. Okay, now let's move on, and we can do a little bit on the movie. And I thought, let me see. I think I have. Okay, so let me throw out a question. Maybe someone wants to answer it. Based on the questions I gave you on your discussion board, which I haven't looked at yet, what role would you say fundamental attribution error, blaming the victim, I'll look at those two, play in the story of Rashomon? Who wants to answer that? Nobody? Okay, chicken. Okay, how about Cameron Nahar? Cameron? Sleeping? Okay, how about Brianna? No response? Anyone alive out there? How about Melissa? Oh, she was absent. How about Annam? Annam? All right. All right, maybe I'll just go down the list alphabetically. Syed, how about Syed?
Professor, can you please repeat the question?
Yeah. Okay. The question is, what roles do fundamental attribution error, blaming the victim, and self-serving bias play in Rashomon?
So basically, I feel like they all lead to like a lack of understanding. They can create misunderstandings. They can create misjudgments, and like a lack of critical evaluation in like the situation.
Very good, Syed. So how would you define fundamental attribution error?
So fundamental attribution error, basically, it has like, it can create misunderstanding through like a lack of ground-based evidence, I guess.
Okay, good try. Fundamental attribution error means that people tend to attribute internal causes to behavior even when behavior is called by circumstances, by external causes. So for example, if somebody gets into a car accident, let's say some guy gets into a car accident, people will say it's the guy's fault, whereas it may be that there was some physical, something hit him on the head, or there was some external reason why the car accident occurred. So in other words, people tend to blame things on people's behavior on people themselves rather than on the circumstances. And very often in business, the circumstances are what drives performance. Okay. Yes.
So for example, can that be like you know how like if there's like a school shooting or something like a shooting, instead of blaming like gun laws, people would blame like a mental disability. Is that like an example to that? Because you're talking about how like
Yeah, that would be an
people would blame
example.
it.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
That would be an example. So it could be, yeah, like, you could say like somebody is homeless and you can say, well, that it was their doing, but actually, you know, what happened was that there was a group of circumstances that caused the person to lose their home or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, good, very good. All right, good start. Okay, Samima, what is the role of self-serving bias in Rashomon? Samima? Okay. Alessandro, what is the role of self-serving bias in Rashomon?
Professor, I thought the assignment was due tonight. That's why I haven't started it yet.
Oh, okay. Well, you want to take a guess anyway? Oh, you haven't seen Rashomon.
No, I haven't yet because, like I said, I thought it was due tonight, so I was going to do it after our work today.
Okay, I'll let you do that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No problem. Okay, David?
Professor, can I answer the question?
Yes, of course.
So self-serving bias in Rashomon, it led the characters to make the situation, rather than focusing on the external factors of the situation, they focused on making themselves look good and focused on the things that they did, but they made it in a way that they looked good in the situation rather than the external factors.
Absolutely. Could you have an example?
Would the victim blaming of the wife be a good example where rather than focusing on
Oh, yeah.
what they did, they were blaming the wife, saying that everything that happened was because of her?
Yes, yeah, blaming the victim. Are you familiar with that phrase?
Yeah, victim blaming.
Yeah, what is that?
Victim blaming is essentially where rather than focusing on the external issues of a situation, you place the blame on the person with whom the bad happened to.
Yeah. So someone's the victim of a crime and you place the blame on them. And this often happens with women in sexual assault situations. So
Yes.
so this was, very perceptive. I mean, this was made 70 odd years ago. So, this is very perceptive thing. And yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Very good. How about, well, I've got you, how about selective perception? How did the film illustrate that? Can you do that one?
Selective perception.
Mhm.
So when the victims, give me 1 second. I have it on Blackboard, so I just wanted to read off of that instead. Say it in my own words.
Go ahead.
Okay, so selective perception is when they chose to see the situation in a way that either benefited themselves or from their tunnel view. Is that the term, tunnel view, where you
Mhm.
see things in a way that you want to see them rather than in the way that they occurred? It's kind of like yeah, that's basically what it is.
It's not necessarily like, it could be that you have a bias that you want to see it that way, but it could also be that you just don't see it. It's not that you've even thought about it. It's just the way your perceptual makeup is. You don't see certain things, often.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it
Often,
like tunnel vision?
yes,
Yes.
but yeah, it's tunnel vision, but we all have it. I mean, even if we're impartial to something, we often won't see it. That's one of the reasons why rational problem solving is limited. We often don't see the alternatives, even if we want to. So, that's why if you ever look at a book of brain teasers, the reason they're so hard is that they go outside our normal framework of thinking. And when you see the solution, you say, oh, I should have thought of that, but it's not how we normally think, so just to give you an example from another class I teach, it's in the book in another class. If you wait a second, what is this? If you you draw nine, you draw nine dots and in a little square, and the problem is how do you draw 3 lines without lifting your pen from the paper that go through every single dot? Okay, and we're out of time, so we'll continue that next time, but you might think about that over the weekend. So I'll see you next time, and I will call on people again, so please try to pay attention, and see you next time. Be well, have a nice weekend.
You too, Professor.
Take care.
Take care, Professor.
Professor, you're calling on
You too. Bye.
me, right?
Pardon me?
I didn't hear you call me before. The attendance.
Who is this?
It's Wu. Last name Su.
Woo. Okay. All right. All right. Why couldn't you hear? Because you came late?
I was here before, but I didn't hear you call me.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, I'll give you credit. See you next time.
See you. Have a great weekend. Bye bye.
You too.